I still remember the morning they told me the house would be closing. It was cold, with a quiet wind that moved through the empty corridors like a memory. I stood in the main hall, holding my cleaning cloth in one hand, and looked at the large mirror above the stairs. It was strange to see my reflection there. I looked small inside that grand house. For 40 years, that mirror had seen me working, moving from one room to another, always careful, always silent. And now it would see me for the last time. The house had belonged to the Benton family for generations. I came here when I was 19, after my mother passed away. At that time, I thought I would stay for a year or two, maybe 3. But time moved quietly, and before I knew it, I was an old woman with gray hair and slow hands, still polishing the same doors, still making the same beds. The family changed, the world changed, but my work did not. I was proud of that. It was the only thing that stayed the same when everything else disappeared. Mrs. Benton, the lady of the house, used to say I had a gift for order. I liked when she said that. She would walk through the rooms after my morning work and say, "Everything feels peaceful now, Mary." She did not know that I often cleaned in silence to stop myself from thinking. It was easier to clean a floor than to clean a thought. I told myself that every polish, every folded sheet, was a small kind of love. Maybe that is why I stayed so long. Now the Bentons were gone. Their children had moved abroad. The old house was to be sold, and the new owners did not need a housekeeper. I was the last one. The gardener had left in spring, and the cook had gone before Christmas. For the past 6 months, it had been only me. Every morning I opened the curtains, made tea for one, and began my work. It was quiet, but I liked the quiet. It was like living inside a memory. Before we continue, I would love to know, where are you listening from? Which city, which country? Share it in the comments. And if you are enjoying this story, please subscribe so you do not miss the next part of The Last Housekeeper. On that last morning, I started my rounds in the drawing room. Dust had started to show on the piano, and the curtains smelled of rain. I opened the windows to let in the light. Outside of the sea, the sea was calm. The house stood on a cliff, and I often watched the waves to see how strong the wind was. Sometimes I imagined the sea taking away everything I remembered, the faces, the laughter, the years, but the sea always brought them back again. I walked slowly into the library. It was my favorite room. I used to read a few lines from old books when no one was around. I was never a clever woman, but those books made me feel close to another world. Sometimes I found little notes between the pages, Mrs. Benton's handwriting, or her husband's, or the children's. A few words like "remember dinner at 8," or "don't forget the garden roses." I always smiled at those notes. They were like small voices left behind. That day, I found one last note under a teacup. It was yellow and soft from years of dust. It said, "Mary, thank you for everything." It was signed by Mrs. Benton. My eyes filled with water. I could not remember when she had written it. Perhaps long ago, before she became sick. For a moment, I sat down and tried to remember her voice. She had a calm voice, soft but clear. She used to say that houses remember kindness. I hoped she was right. I went upstairs next to the bedrooms. The rooms were empty now. Only the smell of old perfume and clean linen stayed. In the master bedroom, I opened the curtains and saw the light fall across the bed. Dust floated in the air like snow. I thought of how many mornings I had stood in that same place, thousands maybe. I could almost see myself young, full of quiet energy, ready to work. I smiled at that girl in my mind, but also felt sorry for her. She had believed that service was the same as love. She had thought that to care for others was enough. She had never asked what she wanted for herself. After lunch, I went into the kitchen and cleaned the table. The air smelled of lemon soap and warm tea. The clock above the stove had stopped ticking days ago. I left it that way. The house was quiet now, like it had stopped breathing. For a long time, I sat at the table with my hands folded, listening to the sea. It was a strange feeling. I was free, but I did not know what to do with that freedom. The afternoon light was soft when I began my final task polishing the silver set. I had done it every Friday for 40 years. I could do it even with my eyes closed. I remembered the first time I polished it, how nervous I was. Mrs. Benton had said, "Do not worry, Mary. Silver remembers good hands." She was right. The silver still shone, even when my hands had grown old. I placed the clean pieces carefully into their wooden box. As I touched each one, I thought of all the dinners, the laughter, and the faces that once filled this place. I thought of how many times I had served others, smiled politely, and stayed in the background. I had watched children grow, guests arrive and leave, and seasons change through the tall windows. Yet I had never been part of it. I was there, but unseen, like a piece of furniture. When the clock struck 6, I put away the last piece of silver. I took off my apron and folded it neatly. My hands shook a little. The smell of polish and lemon filled the air. I looked around the kitchen one last time. It was clean, silent, perfect. For years I had tried to make everything perfect. And now I wondered why. Before leaving, I went back to the hall. The mirror still stood there, showing the late light of the setting sun. Looked into it again. My face had lines I did not remember. My hair was thin and pale. My eyes looked calm but tired. For the first time, I saw not a housekeeper, but a woman who had lived her whole life for others. I wanted to ask that woman what she wanted, but no answer came. I locked the front door and placed the key in the small box by the stairs, where Mrs. Benton always kept it. Then I stepped outside. The air was cold and smelled of salt. I looked back at the house, the windows dark, the walls strong but empty. For a moment, I felt as if the house itself was watching me go. The road to the village was long and quiet. I walked slowly, carrying a small suitcase. I did not have much. My hands were tired, but my heart felt light, almost new. I did not know where I would go next. I only knew that for the first time in my life, the day belonged to me. Before I continue with the story, please like, subscribe, share, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Your support means a lot. Now let's continue. When I arrived in the village, the sky had already turned gray. The houses were small and close together, nothing like the grand Benton estate. I found a small room to rent above a bakery. The woman who owned it was kind. Her name was Mrs. Harlow. She gave me a cup of tea and said, "You can stay as long as you need, dear." I thanked her, though I did not know how long that would be. I had never rented a place on my own before. I had always lived where I worked. It felt strange to have a key that opened only my own door. That night, I sat by the small window and listened to the sounds of the street below. I could hear a few children laughing, a dog barking, and the soft wind moving through the trees. It was a quiet night, but not the same kind of quiet I knew at the house. This one was alive. Still, I felt something missing. I was used to the rhythm of work, the sound of my own footsteps in large, empty rooms, the ticking of the clocks that once marked the hours of my life. Now time passed without any shape. I did not know what to do with it. In the morning, I woke up early out of habit. I made my bed carefully and cleaned the little table by the window. I had no silver to polish, no curtains to wash, but I still found things to straighten and fold. When I finished, I sat down with my tea and realized I had nowhere to be. For the first time in 40 years, no one was waiting for me. The thought both frightened and excited me. I went out for a walk through the village. The bakery downstairs smelled of fresh bread, and the warm air made me feel safe. People greeted me as I passed, their smiles gentle, without hurry. I stopped by the churchyard and watched the old trees move in the wind. They looked so peaceful, standing there through every season. I thought of the old house again, standing on the cliff with its empty rooms. I wondered who would move in, who would walk through those halls where my life had passed quietly for so long. At the corner of the main street, I saw a notice board. There were small papers pinned on it, ads for jobs, sewing lessons, and a few people looking for help in their gardens. My eyes stopped on one small note written in careful handwriting. It said, "Elderly lady needs help 3 mornings a week, housework and tea preparation." I smiled. It was not far, only a few streets away. My hands had not forgotten how to care for a house, even if my heart was tired of it. But something inside me said, maybe this time it could be different. I met Mrs. Palmer the next day. She lived in a small cottage with blue shutters and a rose garden in front. She was in her 70s, thin, with kind eyes and a soft voice. When I told her I used to work for the Benton family, she looked surprised. "Oh, that beautiful old house by the sea," she said. "I remember hearing stories about it when I was young." I nodded, though I did not say much. I did not want to speak of the house yet. It still lived too strongly inside me. Working for Mrs. Palmer was not difficult. She liked things tidy but not perfect. She often told me to leave something for tomorrow, a sentence I had never heard in my life. She did not expect silence either. Sometimes, while I polished the furniture, she would sit nearby and talk about her garden, her late husband, or the books she loved. I listened and answered when I could. At first, it felt strange to talk while I worked, but slowly it became natural. There was warmth in her company, something gentle that reminded me of kindness I had long forgotten. One afternoon, while I was sweeping the kitchen, she asked me, "Mary, what will you do now that the house is gone?" I stopped for a moment, thinking. "I do not know," I said honestly. "All my life I worked for others. I never learned how to work for myself." She smiled. "Then maybe it is time to learn." Those words stayed in my mind long after I left that day. They sounded simple, but they felt heavy, like something I should have known long ago. In the evenings, I started walking to the sea again. It was not far from the village. The air smelled of salt, and the sound of the waves felt familiar. Sometimes I sat on the bench near the cliff and looked toward the old Benton house in the distance. It was smaller from there, almost hidden by the mist, but I knew every corner of it. I tried to let it go, but part of me was still walking those halls, still hearing the quiet sound of my own steps. Letting go of a place is harder than packing a suitcase. It takes more than hands. It takes time. Days turned into weeks, and I began to see small changes in myself. I laughed more easily. I started to bake small loaves of bread in the shared kitchen, something I never did at the house, because the cook did not like help. I began to talk with Mrs. Harlow's grandchildren when they came to visit. They liked to ask questions about the big house. They imagined it full of secrets. I told them small stories, nothing sad, about the garden, the dogs, and the Christmas lights. I kept the rest to myself. Some memories were too quiet to share. One Sunday, I went to the small market in the village square. I bought apples, bread, and a second-hand book with a soft green cover. It was a collection of short poems. That night, I sat by the window and read them slowly. I liked how each poem felt like a tiny room, simple, still, and full of emotion. I thought about how many rooms I had cleaned in my life, but never stopped to think about what they meant. Maybe poems were like clean rooms for the heart. They gave space for feelings I had never allowed myself to have. A few weeks later, Mrs. Palmer became sick with a cold. I went to her house to bring soup and tea. She smiled weakly from her bed. "You take care of everyone," she said softly. "But who takes care of you, Mary?" I had no answer. When I went home that night, I kept hearing her words. I sat at my window for a long time. The village lights glowed softly below me, and the sea wind touched my face. I thought about care, about how it had been my whole life's purpose, yet I had never learned to give any of it to myself. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I made tea and sat on the edge of the bed. I realized I wanted something small but new. Not another job, not another duty. Something that belonged only to me. I remembered the poems I had read and thought, maybe I could write one. I had never written anything before, but I picked up a piece of paper and began. My hand moved slowly. The words were simple. The room is empty, but I am not. The sea is near, and I am still here. I read it aloud and smiled. It was not much, but it was mine. As days passed, I wrote more. Short notes, memories, small thoughts. I did not show them to anyone. They were not for others to see. They were my way of remembering that I existed, not as a worker, not as a housekeeper, but as a woman who was learning to live again. Sometimes I looked in the small mirror above my bed and whispered, "This is my day." It felt strange, but good. I began to think less about the house. Its image faded a little each time I walked to the sea. It was still there, but it no longer owned my mind. I started to belong to my own life again. For the first time, I was not serving anyone. I was simply being. It was early autumn when I heard that the old Benton house had finally been sold. The news came from Mrs. Harlow, who read it in the village paper one morning. "They say a family from London has bought it," she told me as she placed warm bread on the counter. "They are coming to live there next month." I stood quietly, holding my cup of tea. For a moment, I felt something sharp in my chest, like a thread pulling me back to the past. I had known this day would come, but knowing did not make it easier. That night, I could not sleep. I lay awake and thought about all the years I had spent in that house. It was strange to think that someone else would soon walk the same halls, open the same windows, and light fires in the same rooms. I imagined them moving furniture, repainting walls, perhaps removing the old mirrors. I wondered if the house would still remember me after all that. The next morning, I decided to visit it one last time. I wanted to say goodbye properly, not just to the building, but to the person I used to be. The road to the cliff was long and narrow, covered in fallen leaves. The air was cool and smelled of the sea. As I walked, I tried not to think too much. I wanted to see the house not as my past, but as something that had given me lessons, even if they came too late. When I reached the gate, I stopped. The iron bars were covered in rust, and the garden was wild with tall grass. I opened the gate slowly, and the sound of it creaking made my heart jump. It was the same sound I had heard every morning for 40 years. I walked up the path, and there it was, the Benton house, still tall and proud against the gray sky. It looked tired but strong, like an old friend who had been waiting for me. The windows were dusty, and the curtains had been taken down. I looked through the glass of the kitchen window and saw emptiness inside. No light, no warmth, only space where life used to live. I remembered every detail of that kitchen, the clock above the stove, the smell of lemon polish, the sound of rain on the roof. Now it was silent. I placed my hand on the cold window and whispered, "Thank you." It felt strange to talk to a house, but I knew it understood me better than anyone. I walked around to the garden. The roses were gone, replaced by wildflowers. The sea was still strong below the cliff, the waves moving like slow breathing. I sat on the old bench where I used to rest after work. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind. It carried the same sound it always had, the mix of sea and memory. For a moment, I saw myself there again, young and full of purpose, hurrying to finish my tasks before dinner. I wanted to reach out to that girl and tell her something simple, that life is more than service, and care should also belong to yourself. As I sat there, a car stopped near the gate. A young woman stepped out. She looked about 30, with brown hair tied back and a notebook in her hand. She smiled politely when she saw me. "Are you from the village?" she asked. I nodded. "I used to work here," I said. "A long time ago." She looked around and sighed. "It is beautiful, even now. We are going to repair it. My husband and I want our children to grow up by the sea." Her words were simple, but they filled me with warmth. The house would live again. New laughter, new footsteps, new light in the windows. It was not the end. It was a beginning, just not mine. "It will be a happy home," I said softly. She smiled again. "I hope so. Would you like to come inside? I could show you what we are planning." For a second, I wanted to say yes, but then I shook my head. "No, thank you," I said. "I think I have already said my goodbye." She looked at me kindly, as if she understood. "You must have loved it here," she said. I took a deep breath. "I did," I answered. "But I love my freedom more." She smiled again, and I walked away. As I followed the path back to the road, I did not look behind me. I did not need to. I carried the image of the house inside me already. It was no longer a place of duty. It was part of my story, but not my life anymore. The walk back to the village felt lighter than before. The air seemed softer, the sound of the sea friendlier. When I reached the bakery, I saw Mrs. Harlow sweeping the front step. She waved and smiled. I went upstairs to my small room and sat by the window. The sun was low, painting the rooftops gold. I opened my notebook and wrote again. I wrote about the house, about Mrs. Benton, about the quiet years, and about learning to be alone without being lonely. I wrote that I had lived for others for most of my life, but now I was learning to live for myself. The words came easily, soft and clear, like the sound of waves. When I finished, I felt calm. The past did not hurt anymore. It felt like an old photograph, something I could hold without sadness. Weeks passed and autumn deepened. Mrs. Palmer's health improved, and she often invited me to tea. Sometimes we sat together in her garden and talked about the seasons. She told me about her youth, and I told her small pieces of my story. She said, "You must keep writing, Mary. You have a gentle way with words." I smiled. "Maybe one day I will share them," I said, "but for now they are mine." One evening, I went to the sea again. The sky was pink and gold, and the water was calm. I walked along the shore, my feet sinking into the cool sand. I thought about everything I had been: the young girl, full of hope, the quiet housekeeper, the lonely woman, and now someone new. Not young, not perfect, but free. I sat on a rock and watched the sun slowly disappear. The light touched the waves like silver. For a moment, everything felt still. I thought about Mrs. Benton's words so many years ago. Houses remember kindness. Maybe people do too. Maybe, after all the years of giving, I had finally learned that kindness must start with yourself. When the last light faded, I stood up and walked home. The road was quiet, and the world seemed peaceful. I felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes when you have finished something important. I was not the last housekeeper anymore. I was simply Mary, and for the first time, that was enough. If you liked my story, please like, comment, and share.